What's going on, everybody? Ifan here, and I'm continuing my uh, Bible study reflection. And the last time that I spoke with you, I was speaking about how crisis is an opportunity for promotion, and we were focusing on Joseph in the book of Genesis. And today, I want to continue talking about Joseph because Joseph taught me something very interesting about hindsight. You know, there's that phrase, hindsight is 2020. It's a very common colloquialism used in our English lexicon, world lexicon. Everybody has some variation of that phrase, that hindsight is 2020, right? I'm sure that many people can point to certain circumstances or things that they went through in their life that when they look back at it now, having the perspective of time and having already gone through it, can look back and say, man, now I know why I went through that. Or now I understand why that didn't work out because it helped me to do this. And so hindsight is 2020 is really just an option for us to, in retrospect, understand circumstances that we lived through. I mean, when we were going through it, it didn't feel good. When we were going through it, we didn't understand why. But once you come out of it, that's the time that you're able to go back and say, now I understand why that happened. And so Joseph shows me that in his story, because in Genesis chapter 50, verse 19, and reading into verse 21, Joseph says this. He says, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. And just to give you some perspective, what happened was that Jacob had finally passed away. Jacob was the father of Joseph and all of his brothers. And so when his dad died, when Jacob passed away, the brothers really got scared. They thought that now that Jacob was no longer alive, that Joseph was going to exact his revenge for having them sell him into slavery. And the precursor for this really comes in chapter 45. You know, in chapter 45, when he finally revealed himself to his brothers, he said to them to come close to me. And when they had done, he had revealed himself to them and said that I am Joseph. And he said, "Do not be distressed. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." And so even then, he had already kind of reflected about hindsight. It was kind of like, in hindsight, you selling me into slavery was really so that God could prepare the way for you by using me to save many lives. You meant it as an instrument of evil, but God was able to turn it into something good. And, you know, that's church speak. And when I say church speak, a lot of times people who are in church or who have grown up in church, they have these common phrases that we will use. What you meant for evil, God meant it for good. They're taking that from Joseph. That's a lesson from Joseph. You know, it's not just a phrase. Joseph actually said it. He said it in chapter 50. We just read it. But the thing is that all of us have in our respective lives, we have situations and circumstances that we go through that we only come to understand the purpose of it in hindsight. And many of us right now, as I record this, we are going through a pandemic. We are going through one of the biggest pandemics in world history. We haven't seen something like this in a very long time, not since 1918. And many of us are growing restless. We are sitting in our homes. We are being asked to social distance. We are being tasked with the responsibility to care for the health of our neighbor. And we are growing restless. But in reality, what I take from just this experience and what I learned from Joseph is that we will not understand why this was impactful or meaningful in each of our respective lives until we've come out of it. And I don't know what that's going to be for each and every one of you who is listening to this, but understand that this time of social distancing, this time of isolation, this time of staying at home, it is going to mean something, and it will only be understood in hindsight once we come out of it. The question is, what are you doing? Because look, Joseph, in the midst of going through what he was going through, being sold into slavery, working in Potiphar's house, getting accused by Potiphar's wife, then subsequently being thrown in jail, then having the baker and the cupbearer forget about him when they get out of prison, him finally being called out of prison to interpret Pharaoh's dream, and then subsequently becoming the second in command to Pharaoh. All in the midst of him going through these things, I am sure that there were different decision points at which Joseph was wondering, why in the heck am I going through this? Why is this happening to me? Another thing is happening to me. Another negative thing is happening to me. So Joseph, all throughout that, let's not lose the humanity of who Joseph was. Joseph was probably in the midst of going through all of that. He was probably wondering, what in the heck was God doing to him? He loved God. He was obviously gifted because he was able to interpret dreams. He was skilled and capable and had the ability to manage the affairs of people. He had done that in Potiphar's house. So he was a skilled person who loved God, who, aside from maybe his exuberance and slight arrogance of thinking that he could share his dream with his brothers and that they would not go against him, he was a general, overall good dude. And so I'm sure he probably went through these things and said, why me? But then when he comes out of it, only then could he say, what you meant for evil, God intended for good. And so I wonder, for many of us who are going through this season of stay at home and this season of being sheltered in place and social distancing and all of those things, I wonder, when we come out of this, because eventually we will come out of this period of pandemic, this period of social distancing, this period of staying at home, the question that I have is, will you be able to, in your individual life, go back and say, now I understand that what was meant for evil now was turned into good? Will you be able to say that in your life? And really, it depends on you, right? Because like I said, Joseph was doing things in the midst of going through his time of trial and testing. So you really will be able to determine whether or not coming out of this, you'll be able to say what Joseph said based on your actions and what you're doing. Now, I'm not suggesting that people do things that are illegal. I'm not suggesting that people buck against the system. I'm not suggesting that people do anything that is going to be deemed inappropriate. But what you should be doing is challenging yourself to find ways of self-development and self-improvement. You know, I preached a sermon last week about sowing and reaping, and I mentioned the fact that if you sow into the Spirit, you will reap the benefits or the fruit of the Spirit. And so if during this period you are sowing into the Spirit while you are in isolation, when you come out of isolation, you will reap great fruit. Well, the same could be said about the personal development. If you are reading books, if you're learning a new business, learning a new trade, learning a new language, if you are doing things to improve yourself and to work on self-development, coming out of this, you may find that opportunities will present themselves that you will be equipped for because during your time of isolation, you were working on yourself. That could be an example. I'm just saying it could be an example of what was intended for evil was now used for good. It could be that during this time you are preparing yourself. Maybe you are in a season of singleness, and right now you're preparing yourself and you are working on yourself, your character, you are working on your spirit, you are working on putting things in order, paying down debt, doing things that will prepare you to be ready to be a spouse to somebody. That could be, well, during this time of social distancing, what was intended for evil, God now used for good. It could be that during this time of isolation that you've learned a new skill or trade that can become a business. And as a result, coming out of the pandemic, you now have a viable business that now pays you more money than you were making at your job that you were furloughed from. That could be another example of what was intended for evil, God now used for good. Those are just 3 examples of many that I can think of where you could have a Joseph mentality that in hindsight, looking back at this was a good thing. It was meant for evil. It could have made me crazy. It could have caused me to have higher anxiety and to be upset at the world, or to be critical and upset with our government and the decisions that they made and all of this type of stuff. It could be that, or it could be that what was meant for evil, what was meant for me to have a breakdown, God now used it for good. So I don't know what that's going to look like for everybody, but I hope that that helps you, because for me, Joseph taught me something powerful about why it is good for certain things to happen for us, because through that testing, something good comes out of it. All right. Well, you guys take care. I hope this was helpful, and you remain blessed.